Fashion, a topic that is full of mystery for some, or is the object of obsession for others, but nonetheless something we engage with on almost a daily basis, whether we realize it or not. From choosing items based on personal aesthetics and tastes, to chasing down trends, to even something as simple as choosing what to throw on that day, fashion permeates our lives on a fundamental level. But there's more to this world than glossy magazines and articles with 10 tips on how to dress better, whatever that might mean. Throughout the years, fashion has been used as an artistic medium to express conceptual ideas, emotions, and even mourn those that came before. And like any other artistic medium, it can move across genres, finding itself in places bright and full of joy or dark, moody alleys rife with haunting emotion. And this, my friends, is where we find ourselves today. In my original video, Horror in High Fashion, a lecture, I created a presentation with the intent to challenge the preconceived notions of couture and make a case for horror themes on the runway, with the end goal being to show that there is more to horror clothing than prints on t-shirts and cleverly made merch. And to this end, I feel I succeeded. The response was incredibly positive, and the request for more was made, and I am here to oblige you. But before we dive into it, let's refresh ourselves on commonly used terms as well as establish the guidelines for this video. Our two biggest terms of the day are couture and horror. The latter we can define in two ways. Horror, as an emotional reaction, can be defined as an intense feeling of shock, fear, or disgust, with horror as a genre being defined as speculative fiction intended to disturb, frighten, or scare. For ease, horror can be boiled down to a general feeling of dread in terms of emotional response, and in media, anything that might elicit that response, but is not necessarily exclusive to that genre. Now, couture has a singular, much more solid meaning, so much so that it is regulated by law, specifically French law. Allow me to elaborate. Couture, an abbreviation from the French haute couture, meaning high dressmaking or high sewing, essentially denotes a higher quality of work in terms of sewing techniques, materials used, construction, and overall design. Couture, in of itself, in fact, translates to dressmaking. The legal regulation comes in with the founding of the Chambre syndicale de la haute couture. Founded in 1868, it is this institution that regulates and sets the standards for what is and is not considered haute couture. And so, by this institution's own rules, to be considered a couture house, the following qualifications must be met. Made-to-order designs for private clients, that is, a custom piece for each person who orders, where at least one fitting takes place. Maintaining at least one workshop or atelier with at least 15 general staff and 25 technical workers. Think like pattern makers and drafters, specialists in various sewing techniques, and so on. Collections presented must have a minimum of 50 designs to be shown in January or July. Guests are invited to show collections each season, and so if a guest is able to obtain 4 of these invites, they become eligible for membership. To summarize, couture fashion is more or less the highest quality of work that can be offered within the fashion sphere, nearly fully custom and is considered to be exclusive, given the nature of needing a set amount of invites in order to be considered. Now that we have defined and broken down our terms, let's now turn to how we will organize the fashions we are about to examine. For this, I have come up with a unique but familiar system. In order to further discuss the topic at hand, we must return to the original iceberg from our previous video. As a horror fashion iceberg did not exist previously, as far as I am aware, I took it upon myself to make my own. A smaller iceberg, though, it consists of 3 layers, and they are as follows. High-end reference. This directly references horror media via high-end fashion brand. Ambiguous reference. Items shown on the runway that use similar designs to those in their reference material, but fall more into the if you know territory. This tier can also engage in something we will be calling subgenre play. Direct symbolism. Pieces that do not reference established horror media, but rather horror as a concept, clothing and presentation that evokes the idea of discomfort, death, and other common themes. And this is a tier that directly engages in this subgenre play. But what is this subgenre play that I keep referencing? Subgenre play here is intended to mean fashion that is engaging or referencing in different subcategories of horror or horror-related content, including but not limited to the following: spooky vibes, vintage Halloween or autumnal themes, gothic or dark alternative themes, gore or true horror, and horror tropes. Notable examples include the bloody bride trope, skeletons, and references to death or dying, possession, and evil spiritual themes. In short, referencing Halloween, dark, spooky, or horror concepts as opposed to directly tying themselves to specified horror media. This allows for the clothing to step outside the realms of expensive merch and become much closer and more familiar to what we would consider traditional runway fashion pieces. A lot of early alternative fashion falls into this category. Think broad strokes down to narrow details and back again, as fashion always tends to take place in cycles. So we will sum up where each show falls at the end of each segment. However, one iceberg simply isn't enough for our needs. Now hold on. Calm down. Hear me out. The secondary iceberg will serve as our primary guide through time, themes, and overall depth of presentation, as well as an aid for our more visual learners in the audience. See? It's not so bad, right? Now, with these things in mind, the guidelines for the rest of our exploration are as follows. I will not be going into costumes or work done on movie sets. That is an entirely separate category that deserves its own video. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, coming soon, maybe, perhaps. However, it is fully acknowledged and will be repeatedly acknowledged that fashion and film feed into each other near constantly. Media of any kind is not an island, and everything is in fact interconnected, always has been, but more on that another time. Secondly, I am but one octo woman and can only cover so much on my own. I have done my due diligence and dug and explored as deeply as I possibly can, but some things are bound to be missed, and if I overlooked your favorite creepy couturier, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear about them. And with that, let's get into horror and high fashion part 2, the deep cut. Now, there is a degree of difficulty in going exceptionally far back in fashion for what we are looking for. The reason being twofold. Alternative fashion, usually what we would think of today as goth, grunge, punk, etc., was often rolled in with more traditional expressions of horror in clothing. Secondly, the archiving efforts of shows and collections are unfortunately lacking, especially that of the 80s and 90s, and also I had to do this while the Internet Archive was down, so while our beginning here may seem a tad sparse, the collections and shows displayed are what I believe to be solid examples of developing horror references and aesthetics in the fashion world. Let's start from the top and work our way down, shall we? The 80s had several pockets of mainstream fashion, being propelled by keywords such as power, preppy, and yuppie. Broad-shouldered and well-structured suits centered on demonstrating women's power aimed to bring femininity forward, whereas the yuppie style caused great division on its own, skewing somewhere between timeless and tasteless, while preppy styles sold an Americana fantasy. Overall, the mainstream fashion of the 80s was centered on big, opulent, and the word more. But on the flip side, where we lay, we first have what were being referred to as new romantics, an offshoot of London punk culture, though still being centered in and on music. The new romantic style played with these themes such as flamboyance, androgyny, and theatrics. These concepts were displayed through frills, Victorian-inspired garments, and rich fabrics and materials. Now, in punk, we had themes of anarchism, anti-fashion, and deconstruction. These themes were displayed through the taking apart and upcycling of clothing, the use of safety pins to hold garments together, and the use of various odds and ends such as razors and padlocks as accessories. And while the two often conflicted with each other due to separate values, with the new romantics aligning themselves to be more escapist and aspirational, and punk being direct and assertive, they were both still considered countercultures. In terms of our iceberg, the designers involved in these subcultures were working with direct symbolism, designs and concepts that reference specific ideas in the vein of going against the grain of mainstream society through the manner in which they chose to dress. If we want to split hairs and bring the genre play aspect into it, some would fall under romantic, though the more punk-leaning styles would not. Examples of this are Conan Bell and Vivienne Westwood, both designers who played into the punk and even a touch into the new romantic substyles. With a very DIY feel about the clothes, loads of layers and attitude, these particular stylists wanted to bring edge and a sense of self to their work and the people that wore it. And now you're asking me, seamstress, what is the relevance? These fashions aren't exactly dark, spooky, or really all that terrifying, and the answer is simple. These two styles made way for what would become the goth subculture, and subsequently what we would come to recognize as modern gothic fashion. This, combined with the horror film boom of the time, would see truly remarkable and macabre looks take the runway, accompanied as well by some more subdued, classy, spooky looks. And while goth is not necessarily horror, it is certainly and is confirmed to pull from it to a degree. These two things exist in symbiosis with one another and are key to each other's progression. The music scene of the 80s began riding a dark wave of sound and ever-increasing intense atmosphere. Add in the fascination and romanticism of the Victorian period literature and several cans of Aquanet, and the black-clad fashion finds its foothold. But not only in London clubs and musically inclined spaces. It began to find itself on the runway in the hands of couturiers who pushed the envelope in their own unique ways, leading us to the grungy, dirty, dark life of the 90s. Post-stock market crash of '89, the opulence and greed-centered concepts of 80s clothing were abandoned in favor of more minimalist or clean, simple looks, at least as far as the mainstream runways go. Concurrent to this, grunge was making its way onto the scene, with gothic aesthetics still going at their own pace. And it is here where we see a cross-section of elegance, grit, and finally, the main attraction, horror entering fashion. Starting us off with a blend of the edgy and ethereal, we have Martine Sitbon. Beginning her career as a freelance designer, she launched her own label in 1986. In her collections, we see a blend of 90s grunge with Victorian details, playing with concepts of alternative femininity, tinged with a feeling of melancholy. In her Spring-Summer 1993 collection, we see direct symbolism in the form of witchy looks, most notably being the ensemble worn by Kate Moss. There is a welcoming kind of coldness to Sitbon's work, evoking the feeling of chilled October nights and dimly lit parlor spaces with rich fabrics and long drape, flavored with just a bit of edge in the use of open tops and sheer mesh. With large hair and dramatic accessories, these women appear to know more than you or I, captivating their audiences with a distinct yet eerie allure. Further works, such as Sitbon's Fall 1997 collection named Les Arbres, or The Trees, forgive my butchering of the French, would continue to play with these moody, lighter horror symbols by adorning the garments with the eerie silhouettes of brambles and branches. These images, paired with stiff collars, precise tailoring, and pops of red, give us that haunted forest feel without being exceptionally overt. A walk through a dark wood, but more quiet and subdued. Progress through the era brings us to the runway bad boy himself, Alexander McQueen. Riling up the London press with his 1992 graduate collection, Jack the Ripper Stalks His Victims, and established the use of narrative themes throughout the continuation of his work. This collection also set the precedent of aggression and other macabre themes in McQueen's work, with overt violence and blood not being something he shied away from in his lifetime. Both of these elements being featured on the titular frock coat of the collection, the jagged barbed wiring stained with blood across a vibrant pink background. A hidden feature of the piece was a lock of hair, according to McQueen his own at the time, sewn into the lining, this being in reference to the practice of prostitutes selling their own hair. The point here being that the beginning of McQueen's career was colored with references to the horrors we face in reality. See the Breakout collection of 1995 titled Highland rape, addressing the abuse faced by the Scottish at the hands of the English, and horror concepts discussed here in the next two collections, McQueen's 1995 spring ready-to-wear pulling from Hitchcock's The Birds, and spring 1996 ready-to-wear that pulls from the erotic vampire film The Hunger, concluding with the fall 1997 show, which pulls from a very recognizable classic. Starting off with the 1995 collection, we see deliberate use of tailored deconstruction, deliberately placed prints and silhouettes to give the idea of the garment being worn down or torn apart, much like the poor victims of the referenced Hitchcock film. Feathers and bird prints also adorn the pieces, further drawing a connection between clothing and film. A slight deviation is found in several of the looks being made from a sheer plastic-like material, making the garments appear reminiscent of body bags, and though not necessarily intention, even calls to mind the famous Rory line from the 1992 show Twin Peaks.
"She's dead. Wrapped in plastic."
Despite this, however, the high-quality tailoring and clean presentation still allows for the garments to maintain a runway presence. 2 seasons passed from the Birds collection, and we find ourselves at the aptly named Hunger collection, a direct reference to the vampire film of the same name. There is the return of the body bag, plastic-esque pieces paired with the chic monochrome white and blood red ensembles. Bare chests are on display to add an element of eroticism, echoing the film's themes. We also see a look with bloody handprints across the chest, further playing into those horror tropes. However, the most talked about piece from this particular season comes to us in the form of a see-through, worm-filled corset, styled with an expertly tailored, very dramatic coat and skirt, with what has been described by the public as odd silver hip jewelry, with the actual jeweler referring to the silver work as a stag piece. This particular item, or items, in the collection bring together all of the show's and subsequent films' themes together in a cohesive way that is directly referencing death, the erotic, and violence, further driving the point home by having the models flash obscene symbols during their walk down the runway. Concluding our 90s McQueen section with the fall 1997 show, we find ourselves a collection making indirect reference to sci-fi horror classic The Island of Dr. Moreau, in which a mad doctor seeks to create animal-human hybrids of sorts through vivisection. The models were styled with mane-like hair and sharp makeup to give a feline appearance akin to the woman-puma hybrid found in the story. The themes are rounded out through the use of assorted animal hides used to make the garments, some of which are structured and others which are draped tastefully over the model. References to the island itself can be found in the floral embroidery throughout the pieces. While a more simple collection, the moving parts work together to create a well-made whole, and a very fashionable nod to a rather dark story. A Belgian-born designer, Theyskens began his fashion schooling at NSAV in 1994, followed by dropping out and founding his own label in 1997. His first Paris collection of fall 1998 is where our interests lay. Now, an intriguing fact about this particular show is that none of the garments were available for sale and were made by the designer himself as opposed to a working team. Theyskens pulled from his family's collection of linens, antique laces, and even interior fabrics, combining these with themes of anatomy and the unsettling. The result was a beautiful capsule of not only 90s new wave goth, but also a display of the surreal and raw. As very often in horror, we see the body and its parts being used to elicit feelings of discomfort and disquiet, done so here by a backing soundtrack comprised of famous women screaming, and the models being adorned with disembodied mannequin hands paired with garments covered in veins, hearts, and allusions to blood. Theyskens peels back the skin, leaving only the innermost workings on full display, citing inspiration from Florentine anatomical studies. But when viewed through the lens of the horror genre, as observers of the show have done in the past, we are confronted by imagery that makes us flinch ever so slightly. This can be applied to the head accessories made from mannequin hands delicately holding the heads of several of the models, calling to mind images of ghosts, strange things reaching out to make contact with the human world. This combined imagery also brings to mind themes and discussions of bodily autonomy, another popular subject within horror, with Theyskins being quoted with the hands as being a way for me to imagine that these girls had been manipulated or held, looping back into the idea of these hands being otherworldly forces interacting with our own world. The final standout piece in the show is a model covered in fur head to toe. This is, of course, a much more in-your-face expression of the unsettling, going directly for the throat with monstrous imagery. The show as a whole had guests walking away feeling deeply unsettled, and while that disrupted atmosphere was Theyskin's goal, he underestimated just how effective these combined elements would be. Quote, "From the reaction I got back then, a lot of people that were present, some of them felt not very well." The 90s were such a time where shock and awe rose and fell in value in rapid succession, with designers pushing the envelope further and further each time. And by absorbing subcultures into their stylings, or even just pulling from the same inspirational sources purely by chance, it created the environment that allowed for horror tropes to start seeping into runway fashions. And while there are not many exact references like we will see later, direct symbolism was king during this period. We even see the playing with horror genres, the subgenre play we mentioned earlier, with most collections discussed delving into gothic horror, the clothes conveying energy and messages linked to the ever-blossoming darkness of the time. But as said time marches on, so do our clothes. Entering into the 2000s, where tacky and so bad it's good ruled the racks and logos were a must, one wonders how horror within the fashion scene could possibly evolve. And it is here we begin to see what we refer to in our tier system as ambiguous reference, in which these collections take direct inspiration from a specified horror source in such that it becomes a if you know discussion, a coy wink to the audience and a gentle ribbing to those who may not be with the quote-unquote in crowd. Direct symbolism still has its place, however, with many designers choosing to shade their collections with unsettling commentary and imagery. Unsettling imagery being an apt descriptor for McQueen's 2001 spring show. While there is some horror to be found within the clothing itself, this one is more so about the presentation used to display the garments and the models wearing them. Inspired by Victorian-era mental asylums, the models were placed within a mirrored cube, which when lit from within revealed padded walls and tiled flooring. The styling of the models also played into this theming, with heads wrapped in medical headbands and semi-restrictive clothing to keep the arms at the sides, think like a straitjacket. Topping off the styling are taxidermied birds in one model's gown and hair, very much One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Overall, the clothing itself would not seem exceptionally horrific outside of its setting, which is why the context is so important. Without it, we can interpret these items in a very different way, and is why I felt it important to include here. The clothing ranges from tailored suits in hospital grays and greens, to gothic looks to surreal pieces such as Look 37, in which the ensemble is relatively plain until one notices the massive castle piece precariously perched upon the wearer's shoulder. These pieces, ranging so wildly from the mundane to the outright strange, creates a dreamlike quality that when the models press their hands to the glass, you can't help but feel that it could very easily be you inside that box. That no matter how glamorous or plain a life you can lead, you could wind up here too, captured. Shifting gears to something a touch different, we have clowns. Yes, McQueen did in fact have a clown show, his entire reasoning being that clowns are rather frightening. Quote, "We show children clowns as if they are funny, but they're not. They're actually really scary." And such, this concept is well on display in his fall 2001 show, appropriately named What a Merry-Go-Round. The clothing presented in this collection is an interesting assortment of business, cocktail, latex, and drape, a proverbial textile circus, if you will. With McQueen dramatics fully on display in the stylings and cuts of the outerwear, dabbling in S&M themes not only with the fabrics used, but with straps, rope, and chains. Do note the skeleton attached to one of the model's ankles as they drag it about the catwalk. My personal favorite of these bony bedfellows is Look 62, with the simple skull and crossbones motif on a shredded knitwear dress. But what of the clowns? The show closes with a series of models done up in exaggerated mask-like makeup paired with even wilder, near impossibly shaped hair. All the whimsy of the clown converted into something more harsh and hard. Even from an adult perspective, the looks are unnerving, and to a child, it would likely be very frightening to some degree. And so it goes without saying that McQueen successfully blended the line of childhood fear and couture creativity. More shows should have scary clowns, to be honest. For fun. As a treat. And now, when it comes to horror, Dior is not immediately a couture house that comes to mind. However, with the 2006 couture collection comes swaths of blood red and references to gore, all inspired by the French Revolution of 1789. Dramatic gowns all done up in a deep, vibrant red with equally as dramatic skirts resembling the violent spillage of vital fluid, set against the contrasts of skin-tone materials as to emphasize the feeling of being cut open and slashed. The heads of the models wrapped in mesh references decapitation, with several of the looks even resembling scorched flesh, taking a look at look 25 of the show, combining the two for a rather harrowing appearance. The black leather overlaid on top of the sheer flesh tones hammer home the theme of pain. The show is rounded out with deconstructed examples of French opulence, torn apart gowns with exposed peignets and corsetry bones, the very literal taking apart of the old in order to make way for the new. With the horror in that being, yes, things must die in order for new things to replace them. Growth and change require sacrifice in one way or another. And that, to a human being, can be quite terrifying. Likening back to Sitbon's collection from the 90s, Luella Bartley's Fall 2008 collection puts even further emphasis on witchy aesthetic and fall vibes, calling to mind those vintage images of black cats and pumpkins one would see during the Halloween season. The pagan element can be found within the collection as well, directly referenced in the pointed hats and wild hairstylings that adorn some of the models' heads. Citing the Wicker Man as a source of inspiration for these pieces, the influence of the film can be felt in the floral embroidery of the waist pieces as well as the white blouses, much like those the women on the island of Summer Isle wore, with the woolen coats and long trousers calling back to the costuming of the men, both Woodward's character as well as the few men found around the island. These are blended with a general witch vibe, with black garments and veils dotting the collection throughout. This collection, unlike its predecessors, leans more into the kitschy aspects of horror, with its classic red-black and red-orange pairings, pops of gray that make you feel the chill of the autumn wind as you observe the clothing. Rodarte takes an interesting turn as the sisters behind the brand pulled from Japanese horror themes for their collection, which rather differ from horror themes found in more Western culture. And arguably, it's a touch difficult for the untrained eye to see how the show correlates with horror in any sort of meaningful way. However, allow me to illuminate. A very brief bit of background, and I do mean brief. The starts of horror fiction in Japan can be traced back to folk tales within the country's culture, with many of the tropes being established during the Edo period and trickling down into modern Japanese cinema and other media. Beginning with vengeful spirit types, the tropes would eventually evolve to include mutants and the ever-familiar kaiju, though the largest emphasis was placed on these ghosts or spirits, and it is through this lens that we view Rodarte's Fall 2008 collection. The collection opens with soft, dreamlike dresses that give way to torn, textured looks, and then finally into flowing, blood-stained gowns gliding across the runway like the apparitions that inspired them, some of the dresses even resembling shredded skin. An excellent example in a more subtle execution of horror in clothing, the collection weaves a quiet yet haunting narrative, serving as a nice contrast to some of the more intense stylings. Though, as we move forward into the new decade, tacky and monograms all fall out, and maximalism and dressing for the aesthetic fall in. In a time where it was all about the gram, branding became less important, and being the most unique, eye-catching, and totally one-of-a-kind person took center stage. With this in mind, as far as mainstream fashion goes, there is one designer that truly sticks out in terms of freaky style. Gareth Pugh, a designer who began his career with garments that could not be purchased, is highly experimental with his creations, curating a specified aesthetic within his work. Dark, strange, and made of a myriad of unconventional materials and methods, Pugh's overall portfolio borders more on performance art than clothes. The two collections we will be viewing today, however, have almost a narrative woven through them, with one being inspired by pagan rituals and the other aptly themed after sacrifice. Pugh directly references themes of death and ritual within his work with very, very blatant images. Beginning with the spring 2015 ready-to-wear show, the opening pieces are all a stark white, the beginning number resembling that of a straw doll. The second look has the model entirely covered in florals, with those behind draped in white flowing gowns not unlike what might be seen during a festival of sorts, and likens to a more subdued look a la Ari Aster's Midsommar or the aforementioned Wicker Man. At the 10th look, we shift from the stark white to black and white ensembles to fully black garments, nearly an inverse of the models that walked prior. And this leads us to the key elements of the show: the massive pentagram harnesses, the burlap, the twisting black and white patterns, and to top off the theatrics, the bull skulls, conjuring images of the devil, demons, any sort of being you would exchange burnt offerings with in trade for forbidden knowledge. It is a smorgasbord of occult references and showings. The bagged model, completely covered so as to be unidentifiable, a being sent off to their imminent death, the pattern moving and tricking the eye as it is ever so slightly placed off-center, just asymmetrical enough to make you ever so dizzy, like the trance that comes with intense worship. The larger, more elaborate, surreal pieces evoke the feeling of ceremonial garb. This is a series of clothing items that, as it progresses, weaves a story of something, though the audience is never entirely privy as to what that is. Is it a simple harvest ritual, harmless and benign, a practice whose original intent may have been long forgotten to time, or is there something more sinister abound here? That is a decision that can only be left to the individual. Do you assume the bull to be a demon or a symbol of endurance? In following the vein of sacrifice, almost in a literal sense, we come to the sort of sister show of fall 2015. Granted, not a proper sister show, however, there are several shared themes between the two, as noted, the most prominent being the theme of sacrifice or ritual. As in his Vogue article, Pugh is cited as being fascinated by the, quote, idea of sacrificing yourself over to something bigger than you are. Whereas in the prior collection, that something large was found in the bull skulls the models wore. Here we see it take the form of large red crosses painted across the models' faces, and even going so far as to take the symbol up into the model's own hair, with the clothing itself pulling from a range of silhouette and shape, and several garments being reminiscent of military uniform in their cut and fit, and others taking on the appearance of religious garments, both of which are organized entities that present themselves as a larger being, both which attempt to convince the populace that they are worth being a part of. In camaraderie, we as humans find comfort, but there is a terror in melding into one being. The loss of the self is ever present throughout the genre, from body horror to religious horror to media that engages in the ideas of the very true horrors of war. Quite a few games in recent memory have been made available that explore this notion both with and without a supernatural or monstrous element. The fur elements of the pieces could denote either a high rank or a monstrous transformation as becoming a part of an undefined whole. It merely depends on the viewer's perspective, much like the prior collection. There is no defined narrative here either, as the collection simply moves from one piece to the next, the show ending with the model carrying a large red flag, ominous and ever-present. The 2000s and the 2010s were an interesting era of fashion history, horror or otherwise. The name of the game seemed to be about finding the right aesthetic for whatever message one might want to display. As for our shows and our system, Luella Bartley and Dior will go into our ambiguous reference tier, as Bartley's use of embroidery and woolen textures are nearly directly pulled from the Wicker Man, and Dior makes direct reference to the date of a specified revolution on the models, though outside of that, it's still up to interpretation. Our remaining shows go into our ever-familiar direct symbolism tier. For genre play, we have Bartley, Rodart, and Pugh engaging in folk horror very heavily. McQueen gets clowns. Just clowns. With Dior standing on its own with generalized horrific themes. And now you're going to stop me and say, Faye, seamstress, it seems like everything so far is about direct symbolism. We only have 2 examples of this ambiguous reference thing, and we've heard nothing about any of the so-called high-end references. Where are they? So here's the thing about that. The origins of horror merchandise, or rather collectibles really, came into frame with the rise of things like pulp magazines. Horror wasn't being marketed towards the youth necessarily, at least not prior to the 1960s, because horror films were not meant for kids. And then Universal released their films to the matinee theaters, and then television picked them up, and it took off from there, especially once the children started watching. Model kits and plastic toys of the Universal monsters were released, followed by a slew of other merchandise, masks, dolls, coloring books, the full 9 yards. Never mind all the spooky comics that were also being turned loose. And our modern era equivalent for this would be t-shirts and patches and pins, but none quite so popular as the Insert Horror Media Here t-shirt. Quick to print and mass produce, some made limited edition, but all valuable all the same, whether as a piece of history or because, hey, you just genuinely like the piece of media the shirt is associated with. I, in fact, own a few spooky shirts myself. But in the world of high fashion, the humble t-shirt unfortunately doesn't make the cut. Though with some of the stylings I've seen from fashion lovers to indie designers, I think we should open the topic for discussion. The potential's absolutely there. The simple fact, though I hesitate to call it fact because new discoveries are being made every day in regards to clothing, is that high-end brands incorporating horror media into their repertoire is a relatively new phenomenon, at least as far as my own research showed me. As horror is considered a part of pop culture, it makes sense that the imagery and franchising would all be relegated to things that the majority of the populace could get their hands on. After all, that's the point of all that marketing. So we see horror iconography getting picked up by fashion brands later in the game, or rather around 2016, which is the earliest example I could personally find. If any acolytes in the audience locate more, comment down below. There's no such thing as too much information here. I'm separating these out as, 1, the later 2010s are more of a transitional period in terms of dress. Keep in mind, fashion trends are not just sharp, sudden turns. They're gradual shifts in one direction or another, especially with social media coming into play very heavily during this time. And 2, all of these are either direct one-on-one collaborations with a brand or label and the horror media given, or the collection pulls imagery directly from the horror source. Additionally, it's nice to keep them together for organization's sake, though we'll save the post-2020 shows for the appropriate section. And with that, high-end reference lightning round, go! Citing the 1960 horror film Eyes Without a Face as a source of inspiration, the reference we are looking for in order to be able to place this collection into our category can be found on the blank, stark white masks of the models in this particular menswear show. This, combined with many of the looks mimicking flayed skin, keep in mind the titular female character Christiane, whose face was horribly disfigured in an accident and so keeps it hidden behind a near identical type of mask, creates the necessary ingredients needed for this collection to be labeled a high-end reference. For genre play, we'll go with body horror, as the story is centered on Christiane's disfigurement and the removal of skin from several victims. A true smorgasbord of horror references find their way into Raf Simons' show for Calvin Klein during the spring 2018 season. With a desire to twist the traditional idea of Americana, he brings together the light and the dark. Though the light being the 1950s cuts of the garment, and the dark being references to Carrie, Rosemary's Baby, and Friday the 13th. How did he squeeze so many into one show? Let's break it down. The red-soaked, flowing skirts and overcoats are a direct play on the bloody prom scene in the Carrie film or book. Simons go as far as to even include a red dress, not unlike what one might see at prom. Voorhees can be found directly in the hockey mask heels of the feminine presenting models, and Rosemary's Baby is found in the flowing negligee in soft blue in look 14, as well as in the looks 58, 59, and 61 via the cut of the ensembles. Again, it is the pulling of these iconic, easily recognizable elements that make something a high-end reference. For genre play, we have slashers, psychological, and supernatural. Supreme, known specifically for their logo, which is far more fitting for more 2000s era fashion, took an interesting turn during 2018 by essentially making Pinhead into a printed logo with their collaboration with the acclaimed Hellraiser franchise. Pulling a little bit from all parts of the lore, with the collection featuring a small assortment of army-style jackets, loosely referencing Pinhead's origins as a British army captain. For subgenre play, supernatural horror. Jun Takahashi's brand Undercover is so dedicated to referencing The Shining that he goes as far as to have the models walk in pairs with one another, and while not exactly identical in their stylings, each pairing shares an ensemble identical in cut or silhouette. The show concludes with a properly matched pair of models in the baby blue dresses we're all too familiar with seeing at the end of that special little hallway, though one is covered in blood. This collection goes under psychological horror. Coming back around again to Simons for Calvin Klein and the further exploration of political tensions within America at the time, choosing to do so through the film Jaws, adorning the models not only with tops printed with the near unforgettable poster of the film, but also pairing them with scuba gear and peeled-looking layers. This one gets a Monster by Nature label for our subgenres. Who would be a more fitting fashion icon than the patchwork man himself, Frankenstein? And that is precisely what we get with Prada's Fall-Winter collection of 2019. For both the men and women's wear, the big man himself and his lovely bride are emblazoned across various tops the models wear. Further motifs are incorporated, such as lightning bolts, veins, and exposed hearts attached to the garment via safety pins. As far as genre play goes, Frankenstein falls into the classic monster category. Returning to Undercover with Takahashi's Fall-Winter show of 2019 and following the trend of pulling from films for his shows, the next subject and source of inspiration and reference is the Italian supernatural film Suspiria, Takahashi being so inspired that he even approached the director of the film in order to acquire permissions to use stills and its poster design for his collection. A beautiful array of women's wear, Takahashi captures the powerful and surreal feeling of the film, even in the pieces that do not directly utilize the film's imagery. And again, toss that one under supernatural. In short, we conclude our lightning round with a delightful little cross-section of films and fashion playing together, thus leading us directly into our next decade, the 2020s. Ah yes, the 2020s, a decade in which the fashion trends still remain largely undefined, as styles and aesthetics cycle in and out quicker than ever before in an attempt to chase precious viral fame in the quick feel-good sensation of consumerism. With previously identified tastes being renamed and core added at the end, all with an undercurrent of pining for the before. Merchandise and clothes dance together in a near symbiotic relationship, with many collaborations aiming for that high-quality feel to really land their mark. And so, what we have arrived at is an interesting mix of marketable and deep art, and the two should not be considered mutually exclusive by any means. Just because something is appealing to a wide range of people or is trendy does not denounce its inherent value. Perhaps it is simply a garment that speaks to many, whether it references a beloved franchise or is simply so captivating in its construction that those who may not even be into this sort of thing are left in awe. Further collaborative efforts are made as well, bringing classic horror icons back to the forefront in unique ways, allowing for further use of the high-end reference tier of our system. While we did just technically complete the high-end reference lightning round chronologically, the 2020 Resort Show by Moschino is next on the docket in terms of chronological order, and therefore I get to talk about it. In a delightful reference to all things Halloween, Jeremy Scott puts together a delightful show that references not only classic horror icons like Dracula and Frankenstein, but also famous scenes such as the phone call from Scream, and overall touches on the playful aspect of the season. Skeleton, witches, and other symbols bounce about, and honestly what reads as a very nostalgic party for those who are a bit more young at heart. Though the collection does not lack in maturity, mind you. There are very well-styled ensembles such as Look 30, Look 33, Look 59, and the final looks 88 and 89. If I were to assign genre play to this one, I'm going to go with teen horror or slasher, as the whole show just looks like a gory, cheesy good time just waiting to happen. Set up as more of a spectacle than a proper runway display while utilizing one model and a fleet of trucks, J.W. Anderson created a rather interesting display of images around Milan for his fall 2022 quote-unquote show. His singular model, Harry Neff, impersonated 4 pop cultural characters, with one of those being Carrie. See Look 11 for that. The other portion of this display, that is the proper Carrie-themed parts, was created with Anderson approaching Sissy Spacek, Carrie's actress from the 70s, for her consent to use her images of the character for a series of garments and accessories. With quotes and images emblazoned on dramatic button-ups, pants, and even more high-end hoodies, the collection brings an influencer flavor to the horror genre with this particular presentation. Another collection centered more so on horror in presentation as opposed to the clothes themselves, the Gucci Exquisite collection for Autumn/Winter 22 pulls from Stanley Kubrick films for its backdrop, notably The Shining, as well as 2001: A Space Odyssey and A Clockwork Orange. And while these 2 films do not fall under the horror genre outright, they certainly engage in quite a few horror themes and contain downright horrific scenes. With Alessandro Michel's goal with the collection being to spur concepts of metamorphosis, where, quote, everything can become anything or something else, end quote. There is a true eeriness in becoming something, and during our time here, we have learned we are no strangers to the terrors of change. It can happen to you. It will happen to you. Heaven, the sister label to Marc Jacobs and Happy Explorer of all things strange and unusual, brought to us a Donnie Darko collaboration for 2023. Funnily enough, roughly 1 year ago at the time of this recording. For those in the audience who are not ancient, like myself, Donnie Darko is a sci-fi thriller film from 2001 that follows an awkward teenager, Donnie, that narrowly avoids death via freak accident. Said teenager is then followed around by a strange figure in a bunny costume that only he can see. The bunny, of course, being called Frank. Frank then proceeds to inform our male lead that the world will end in 28 days. While it's an old film, I will not spoil it for you. However, I will denote the very bizarre, chilling nature of this particular piece of cinema. The whole thing is coated in a very eerie feeling. Now, the hallmark feature of the collection was not the clothes, but rather the novelty that the promotional photography was done at the original filming locations for the movie. The range featured zip-up hoodies, t-shirts, and various accessories adorned with the film's iconography, a bit of a Y2K throwback in its approach. It allows for the individual to bring the enigmatic into their wardrobe, should they choose to follow the rabbit, of course. A designer who began his studies before Instagram graced the world, Nochi, forgive me if I butchered that last name, collections were shaped not by images but by books or authors of some sort, and for his fall 2023 menswear collection, he chose to explore the themes portrayed in Bret Ellis's American Psycho. To start, American Psycho explores themes of consumerism, narcissism, several angles of masculinity, satirizing yuppie culture of the 80s, the horror of course being that the rich man at the center of all of it doubles as a serial killer. Nochi, being fascinated with masculinity and specifically the word virile, notes that for him it's a world of inclusivity, expansive rather than reductive, desiring to show the reality of men and the reality of his brand through these men. Though the whole of the collection is not entirely based in reality, as blood-spattered models with slight smirks strut the catwalk in superbly tailored coats. Expertly slashed white button-ups drape across diverse body types, the garment flattering scattering the various and very human shapes throughout the show. Though size-inclusive he may be with his models, there is still a strange, almost too polished look to them, emulating that all too refined life portrayed by Bateman in both novel and film. Robert Wunn, a fairly new face to the scene and with only 4 couture shows under his belt, dazzles crowds with incredible construction, vibrant color, and the simple yet elegant presentation of his works. The Hong Kong-born, now London-residing designer is truly a breath of fresh air within the couture world, and for our purposes, we will be taking a cross-section of his current couture portfolio, as horror themes and imagery can be found throughout the body of work. Body often being meant in the very, very literal sense. Beginning with the Spring-Summer 2023 show, aptly titled Fear, we are treated to a blend of the seemingly mundane, but upon closer inspection find a sinister undertone. With piece names such as The Red Bride, Under the Knife, The Bleeding Coat, and The Ghost Bride, horror is on full display through the couture lens. We even get a direct reference to Stephen King's It with the Georgie Raincoat piece, a bright yellow, expertly pleated raincoat topped with an umbrella headpiece. Moving to the Spring-Summer 2024 couture show titled For Love, we see a return to form with more blood and spirits, with even a reference to possession in the show's closing piece. Robert Wunn is described as seeing a sort of poetry in horror, and this is evident in his method of execution, with the bloody bride look having a sister gown but in candy-coated coloring, creating an interesting and playful contrast to the dark imagery. Exposed brains come to us in the form of a gem-encrusted hat, crystalline blood gently kissing the cheek of the model. Disembodied hands are found throughout the pieces, returning the spirit element to the show. But the most impactful piece of this particular one-ray, however, is the closing piece. An androgynous model in a vibrant red gown, with a haunting entity hovering just over the shoulder, sensually tugging at the strap of the gown with one hand and the other resting gently on the chest. Outside of being an absolute feat of garment construction, the gown serves as a wealth of symbolism, with red being the color of passion, blood, sensuality, hunger, and the accessory being can represent many things. Is it a simple possession? Is the wearer experiencing conflict with her own sexuality? Is passion overwhelming the rational mind? It's a gorgeous piece up for many, many interpretations, a succinct horror staple. On to our Fall 2024 show. At first glance, one would wonder where the horror is to be found, as florals, gravity-defying shapes, and sumptuous drapery glide by the viewer. And then we get to Look 21, something similar to the original Ghost Bride piece, followed immediately by an amalgam of flesh-like fabrics and a felted face. Here we have the body, the skin, in a near literal sense of the word. The pleated material of the skin contains mottled tones, mimicking the natural, uneven aspect to human skin, with the next garment stripping it back even further. The muscles, more flesh, blood, the lines of the muscle fibers being done in bugle beads, sewn standing upright as opposed to flat to give a more raised appearance. And finally, removing all of the flesh parts, we have the bones, the skeleton, frosted hard elements that hang off the gown, shifting with the model's movement, creating an ominous feel as they walk down the runway. And finally, we conclude with the soul, a stunning dress embroidered with hundreds of tiny multicolored crystals. In horror, we often encounter a stripping of the self, a breakdown of an individual, sometimes in the very literal sense, like we see here, whether for better or worse, though I like the quote one leaves us with most. The soul isn't meant to perish. It goes back to the universe. To conclude our section on Wunn, we come to his most recent show, Homecoming, which took place at the Hong Kong Palace Museum in September of this year, as of time of recording. The show is a 10-year anniversary celebration for Wunn, returning to his home where his journey as a designer began. For our purposes, we focus on the reimagined look for the bloody bride gown. Originally a rather intense, striking look, those qualities are only amplified in the reimagined version. Long, sheer draped material pulling with red crystals, echoed in the fabric wrapped around the head, gemstone blood completely eclipsing the left eye and running down the face, creates a beautiful cross of elegance and pain. Known more for his suits as opposed to his scares, Tom Brown has and continues to dip his toes into the horror world, not only with a show fully inspired by Edgar Allan Poe, but also bringing more anatomy to the runway. Beginning with the fall 2024 ready-to-wear show, we are treated to a runway that has been directly inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven, in which a student grieves the loss of his love when, beset by a raven, answers all of his questions with the same ominous word: nevermore. The show itself opens in complete darkness, and as the lights come up, the first model walks through the broken pane of a window. In the center of the stage, there is a large, dark tree. However, it is no ordinary tree. This element is also a model. Dressed in a massive puffer coat topped with a branch-covered headpiece with branches extending from the sleeves of the coat, this comprises our quote-unquote tree. Upon closer inspection, the ground is covered in a sort of snow, and so completes our chilly Gothic setting. The show continues to ramp up the surreal feeling as child models emerge from underneath the tree and begin to follow the first model about. Perhaps she is their mother or school teacher. The show then adds another element of interest as the stage begins to fill with models, circling about each other much like an unkindness of ravens or flock of ravens. Got a bit too into it there. Moving past the gothic and creepy presentation in order to look at the garments themselves, we have a blend of the Victorian and school-inspired uniform, made from heavy black and white fabrics suited for the chill of winter. Prints of ravens and roses adorn the clothes, referencing the key elements of the poem, and the exaggerated proportions of the clothing are a bit Burton-esque in nature, which really adds to the overall aesthetic of the show. Closing our Tom Brown section not with a show, but rather a singular piece, which is Look 42 from the fall 2024 couture show. A stunning gown, stark white on one side, beautiful, beaded, exposed anatomy on the other. Muscle and vein delicately placed across the form through exquisite beading technique, glistening in the light the way wet, bloody muscle would. A nice taste of proper gore on the runway. Maison Margiela, Spring 2024 Couture, a collection that resonated exceptionally strong for yours truly. Over-exaggerated silhouettes paired with porcelain skin and a powerful cross of ghosts in the attic and lost souls wandering the streets of Paris. The show was meticulously planned down to the way the models walked and moved, broken, disjointed, quick, jerky movements akin to broken wind-up toys. The concept of doll being made very literal through not only that movement, but through the makeup provided by Pat McGrath, who developed an entire technique in order to achieve the hyper-glossy look. Several models were even styled with accessories that gave their hands and knees a ball-jointed appearance. And while the torn materials paired with near unreal levels of corsetry cemented the feeling of fine things put away, left to gather dust and sit in their age, with even the underlayers showing the distress. The show overall is layered in eeriness and vintage feel, an encapsulation of haunted doll horror. Now, a little something different. Because while not yet a couturier, but certainly on her way to being one, Hana Yagi is the youngest designer on our list at 24 years of age during time of recording, and in my opinion, an excellent note to conclude the discussion on, because after all, what is a fashion show without the stunning final bridal look? Now, Hana Yagi's work is centered on deconstructing and reconstructing old kimonos and second-hand wedding dresses in order to give them new life as brand new pieces. She values the DIY mentality above most things, her first collection being titled Repair and was inspired by the Japanese process boro, which is layering different kinds of cloth and sewing it together. Hana Yagi creates beautiful, tattered couture, bringing together her desire to repurpose and renew with her love for fantasy fashions. And with this bit of background in mind, we turn to the 2024 Sanguine Bride collection, the pieces for which were made using deconstructed white kimono that had been rented out from wedding halls and then discarded as they had acquired damage. According to Yagi's post on Instagram, quote, "The dresses were deconstructed, reconnected, and dyed with the intention of challenging the patriarchal norms of the wedding ritual. Once dead, the wedding dresses are reincarnated, brought back to life by letting blood flow through them." And let blood flow she did, with striking images taken by Elizaveta Porodina. The initial piece in the collection, going by order of posting on Instagram, begins with a tattered-looking white gown, slowly but surely being stained red by blood, shifting and changing into something else entirely. The bloody bride trope is a popular one in horror, with beginnings in the femme fatale trope now having evolved to be more centered on feminine independence in the modern era, a la good for her type films. The images conclude with the gown now completely black, signifying the metamorphosis concluding, a strong feminine figure staring directly at the camera. While yet an undefined era of fashion, there are still many beautifully terrifying looks to be found, and for our cataloging system, we have high-end reference going to Moschino, J.W. Anderson, Gucci, and Heaven's collections. Ambiguous reference goes to Nochi's American Psycho show and Tom Brown's very poetic looks. And finally, direct symbolism for Woon, Margiela, and Hana Yagi. We also have an impressively wide range of genre play with these shows, from gothic to satirical to supernatural to downright gore being included. And while the 2020s are certainly peculiar times for us all, there is respite in having such a wider variety of creativity available. And so we have come to our end. From the 80s all the way to our current year of 2024, we have explored the darker corners of what the fashion world has had to offer. As alternative cultures and media were absorbed into runway trends, it gave way to a new method of expression for stranger and stranger creations to grace the catwalk where they may not have otherwise been able to do so. Horror in fashion has always been here and will likely persist long after you or I are gone. So should you take away anything from this long journey of ours, I would like it to be this. To the weirdos, the creeps, the odd, and the unusual, there is a place for you here. Create in your clothes, express your darkness, your emotions, become the haunting lore of your dreams, or perhaps even your nightmares, and let nothing stop you.